Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Center's very first research methodology webinar series session. This first one will be on platform trials and the musculoskeletal adaptive platform trial protocol. I wanted everyone to remind everyone that we have a website that we will archive all of these all of our sessions. So if you miss this or if you want to share it with a friend, I'll send out a link, but it also can be found at this QR code on our website. And today's presenters, let me be the first to welcome Dr. Gerard Slobogean and Dr. Sheila Sprague. I'm going to give a quick introduction of them both, and then I will turn it over. Hold on a second, I got this. Dr. Slobogean is professor of orthopedic surgery. He's research director of clinical trials and director of the Master of Science in Biomedical and Translational Science program at UC Irvine. He earned his medical degree and completed a residency in orthopedic surgery from the University of British Columbia. He completed fellowships in orthopedic traumatology at the University of Maryland's Shock Trauma Center and in upper extremity reconstruction at St. Michael's Hospital at the University of Toronto. Dr. Slobogean serves as the Orthopedic Trauma Association representative on Center's Stakeholder Advisory Council, and this research methodology webinar series is actually an idea that he introduced during an advisory council meeting a couple months ago, and we liked it so much that we decided to put it into operation. We're designing this series to bring together the research team members who support clinician scientists in study design, conduct, and analysis to learn from each other and to potentially collaborate on robust trials and ultimately to advance trauma care. Dr. Sheila Sprague is an associate professor in the Department of Surgery at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. She's a clinical researcher with expertise in the design and conduct of large randomized controlled trials, observational studies, and systematic and scoping reviews. She obtained a doctorate in medical science from the University of Amsterdam and a Master of Science in Health Research Methodology from McMaster. Dr. Sprague is a co-principal investigator on several randomized controlled trials aimed at improving outcomes in orthopedic fracture patients. So with that, I am going to let Dr. Slobogean take it over.
Awesome. Thanks, Pam. So as I mentioned, I'll try and get my slides sharing here. And I think your comment about us trying to bring the research community together within Center, I think is bang on, right? And so Sheila and I have kind of recognized that oftentimes there's lots of people that are supporting the clinicians, supporting the clinical researchers, but as a group, they don't get to necessarily meet. And I think one of the other parts that we've noticed over the years is that there really is a strong need to share what we're learning. Like there's common problems when you're designing studies in trauma, such as consent can be difficult, or you don't know they're coming in, so you might miss them, and all these sort of study design issues that can be solved at times with creative designs. And so we wanted to share some of the things that we're doing in orthopedics and start to open up that discussion. Can you see the slides? Everything looks normal. Nothing looks funny.
We can, but we see, okay. I think, the presenter view, Gerard.
So you're seeing what's coming up next,
yes.
Not the actual main slide. Let's see. Well, that's not helpful. All right, let's try this one more time. I never have two screens, so this is kind of frustrating. Let's try this one more time. Sheila, anything to add? Anything to add to that? Because that's kind of where we thought we'd come from, right?
Exactly. And yeah, we want today's session to be interactive. So please stop anytime if you have any questions. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well. So please feel free to write a question into chat while we're presenting.
Yeah. Is this any better?
Yes.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so this work has really been a huge collaboration between Sheila, another colleague of ours, Nathan, and myself, and that's how you end up with a NASCAR set of logos on the bottom here, but it's been fun working with great people like Nathan and Sheila to try and innovate clinical outcomes and trial design for MSK research. But you'll see that most of what we do is really just in the fracture trauma care space. Couple disclosures. We're going to talk a little bit about some PCORI funding that we have related to this. The initial trial design was actually funded by NIAMS and NIH. We also have DoD funding and some OTA funding, and I personally have some industry relationships totally unrelated to this talk. So I'd like to start off by advancing the premise that the status quo for clinical trials is changing. And that the next generation of clinical research is going to use more efficient and complex study designs. I think Sheila and I could talk for hours about these things, but in particular for today, we want to talk a little bit about hierarchical patient-centered outcomes that we tend to use the win ratio analysis for, and then adaptive platform trials, which use a Bayesian framework for assessing. So this is a picture of me building a shack in Point Roberts, Washington, for any of you that know where that is. And it sort of represents the current trial design. I built this one, and then my buddy bought the lot next to me, and we built another one, the exact same thing, right? And our current trial design paradigm really is that we select an intervention to test. We design this trial of treatment A versus treatment B. We create new protocol documents, a new database, new IRB contracts. Startup takes 12 to 18 months. We recruit the patients, we analyze the data, and then nothing is reused after that. And although we may reuse the plans, we may build the exact same shack next door, we really are starting from scratch each time. And so we get faster at building the house, but we're starting from scratch each time. And Sheila, this was really something that you like to talk about, and you've run many multi-center trials now. What do you think the fastest trial you ever started was?
I think probably our fastest trials were like our PREP-IT trials, and they took probably 5 to 7 years from the idea, like from the, let's write this protocol or let's write this grant to final paper publication.
Yeah, I was talking to Chuck Washabaugh, who's the NIH orthopedic surgery program officer, and he said he's never seen an NIH trial start under 12 months. So, I think we're all familiar with this sort of startup, the slow startup legacy. And so we're trying to solve a little bit of this problem. We also recognize some challenges that we have in our current outcome paradigm, right? So Sheila and I tend to work in one of these two bins here: large trials with binary outcomes or smaller trials with continuous patient-reported outcomes, right? So on the left, these are all trials that we've been involved in that we're very proud of, that, we're multi-million-dollar trials, but I think the smallest one here is probably 1,500 patients, right? And so, again, we like binary outcomes. Sheila, I'll put you on the hot spot again. What is it that you like about binary outcomes when we plan a trial? And what type of binary outcomes do we use?
Yeah, we often use the ones that are like specific to the treatment. Like we've used reoperation quite frequently, infection. They're simple to measure. You know that they're changing due to the treatment can change them. And they're sensitive enough to capture the change that the treatment's trying to reduce. So a lot of
I'll add, as the clinician, it's really easy for me to say, hey, this treatment lowers your risk of infection. Whereas on the right side, these PROMs and the promise and some of these things, it's a different conversation to say this treatment's going to improve your promise score by 3 points, right? And so I don't love the interpretation of it, but there's a lot of reasons people use the PROs. One, of course, is that they're patient reported. And two, because they're continuous outcomes, there's this perception that you get more statistical power. And, I can tell you that almost any trial powered on this, the sample size is 100. 100, 120, 150, whereas everything on the left side is over 1,000 patients, at least in the orthopedic trauma space. So I think large trials are often too costly and take too long. This is a trial that I'm involved in right now, and we're several years in, what, to 2021 to 2026, and we're only at 800 patients. We're going to finish, but it's another year and a half's worth of work, and again, a multi-million-dollar effort. And then on the right side, the small trials, I think, are really what contributes to the replication crisis. And hopefully everybody's familiar with this paper from John Ioannidis that's been cited like 1 billion times because it's very provocative, but he actually essentially gives the statistical proofs for why a lot of our research is not replicable and deemed false. And it really has to do with small sample sizes and sampling error. So what are some of the solutions to these two sort of central problems that I brought up? So these are the two that we want to talk about today, hierarchical composite outcomes and Bayesian adaptive platform trials. And obviously, as we go through, we will highlight why we think these are potential solutions. And hopefully you're thinking in your research space, is this applicable to what we do, and how can we do it? And the last thing I will add about this as an intro is, in my opinion, these are two sort of cutting edge things that are being done in research. They're being done in cardiology. You see them regularly in New England Journal and things like that. And so as the funding landscape is tighter and tighter, you can't be going in for grant funding with the same old story, the same old methods, when there are more sophisticated, more efficient designs out there. So another reason I think you should sort of pay attention. So what is a hierarchical composite outcome? Well, hopefully it's all in the title there, right? But it's a composite outcome that explicitly states the order of importance of its components, right? So we kind of think of composite outcomes meaning you throw all three of these things, mortality, ambulation, and days alive and out of hospital, all into one outcome. And if any one of the things happens, they had the outcome, right? And that's the definition of a composite. And a lot of times it works fine for cardiology, where you're talking about MI, mortality, stroke. But when you start putting in, new onset AFib that doesn't really bother the patient for more than 24 hours, or whatever, you start to realize, or a stroke that is really more of a TIA and completely resolves, like you start to realize that they are not actually all the same, right? And so there is a hierarchy to these outcomes, and maybe we can put them in that hierarchy so that it matches the patient's values, matches our clinical values, but also captures more information. And I'll explain why it captures more information. So the first part is mortality, right? So I had the hip attack 2 trial up there. This is a trial that the primary outcome is mortality. And if you think about a lot of our patient populations or research questions, you may only have a 5% mortality rate, or maybe in hip fractures, it's up to 10 or 15%, but it's not 50 or 60 or 70%. And so when you power a trial off mortality, you have the others, the people that are alive, you don't get any information from them. It's really a study about the 5% of people that died. And so the whole experience of those other 95% of the people aren't in your primary outcome. You can always collect secondary outcomes, but it's not in your primary outcome. And that is essentially kind of a waste, right? You don't understand the rest of the outcome experience, right? And so all of the patients can contribute their experience if you have more of a hierarchy that's going to include more outcomes. And I'll explain this further as well, right? And then the other thing, if you're data savvy at all, you'll recognize mortality, dichotomous outcome. Ambulation, we measure in 5 levels. This is now an ordinal outcome. And days alive and out of hospital, this is a continuous outcome. So we now have 3 different data types all into one composite outcome. And that's also not possible in traditional composite outcome analyses. You may have to dichotomize ambulation or dichotomize days alive and out of hospital, and now you're losing information. You're kind of undoing the benefit that you would have of these different outcomes. So a hierarchical composite outcome can handle all of this if you use the win ratio to analyze it. So I'm going to give you an example here. So this is the trial that we are running with that hierarchy that I just showed you. And here are the sort of expected differences between an internal fixation strategy versus a joint replacement strategy for a certain type of femoral neck fracture. So we think arthroplasty is going to reduce death a little bit. 15% to 10%. If you did that trial just on mortality alone, I think that's about a 1,300 or 1,500 patient sample size. We then think that there's some differences in the ambulation and then some differences in days alive in out of hospital. So if you look at this ambulation, this is kind of where we think the ambulation differences would be. And if you powered your trial just on ambulation, you're probably in these, high 9,000, 900, 1,000 patients. And then, of course, if you do days alive and out of hospital with this sort of continuous outcome, you only need like 150 patients. And same problem here. Is that really the most important outcome? Is that the outcome you want to compare these two interventions on? So the win ratio allows us to achieve what we were just talking about. And the win ratio is an interesting way to look at these things. So what you do is, if you imagine 200 patients in the treatment group, 200 patients in the control group, you take the first patient in the treatment group and you compare it to the first patient in the control group. And you compare in that hierarchy of outcomes. So on this page, you see the treatment group person, the first patient, is alive, and the control person died within the 4 months. So you get a win for the treatment group. We don't even progress any further, right? We won on and found a difference on the most important hierarchy outcome, and we stop there. So the treatment group gets a win. We then take the first patient and compare it to the second patient, right? Same thing. Death, well, they're both alive at the primary outcome at 4 months. Ambulation status, the treatment group is ambulating person, that same person is independently ambulating, whereas the control person is using an aid. So the treatment group gets another win. We stop there. Go on to the third comparison. Alive, independently ambulating, both have 90 days alive and out of hospital, so it's a tie. And you probably should also recognize that, like, for a continuous outcome, it's probably rare that you're going to have too many patients that tie with 90 days, exact same amount of days alive and out of hospital. But in this example, that's what we had, and so we got a tie. Go on to the fourth patient, alive, independent, 110 days, so more days alive and out of hospital in the control group. The control group wins. And you do this for every single pairwise comparison. So 200 in each group, you're now getting 40,000 pairwise comparisons, and you get one p-value. So you get a huge statistical advantage, which can lower your sample size tremendously. So in this example that I showed you, we had 2 wins, 1 tie, 1 win for the control group. So you get a 2/1 win ratio. And so the interpretation is the treatment group had twice the frequency of favorable outcomes compared to the control group. Again, you get one p-value, and then in your primary analysis, in the primary tables, you're going to then break down sort of the distribution of the wins, so you can kind of qualitatively see what was driving the wins in this comparison. I can stop there for a quick second and see if anybody has any questions about what I just discussed.
Sure. What are some of the limitations of win ratios? And do you always put three items into them?
Mm-hmm.
How do you decide how many items to put into them?
Yeah, so I'd sort of save that for the very end, but I didn't have any specific slides about it, so it's just really a discussion point. So let's discuss it a little bit right now. So I think the first part is making sure that your hierarchy is patient-centered, right? So we had done a lot of work in advance to come and talk to our patients, figure out what is actually most important to you if you have a hip fracture. So that's the first part, like that there is a justification for your hierarchy, and hopefully that justification is patient-centered. The second is, how many levels are you going to put in there? You can have as many levels as you want, but the more levels you add, perhaps the more confusing or challenging it might be to actually justify the differences in the hierarchy, the differences in the level, right? So the COVID trials used a lot of this, and you could imagine being alive, being still on a ventilator, being on a ventilator for a period of time, never being on a ventilator, right? So those are, let's say, 4 levels that you could see that there's probably a reasonable hierarchy there. But you start putting in things like positive sputum. Well, yeah, maybe you did have a little bit of a pneumonia, but is that really how you want to decide the treatment, who wins, et cetera, right? So that's one part there. The other probably more common criticism, because you will find criticisms of the win ratio out in the literature, is that if let's see, I'm going to go back a couple slides, right? So if you go to this hierarchy, and level 1 makes sense and arthroplasty is better, level 2 makes sense, arthroplasty is better, level 3 maybe doesn't make as much sense, but internal fixation is better, and the majority of the decisions are being made at the bottom, then you're going to kind of get the wrong answer. And that's a criticism, right? So again, arthroplasty decreases mortality. Arthroplasty improves ambulation. And so you got 5% mortality. You got, let's say, 20% of the patients having a difference in ambulation. So now you only have 25% of the population and the decisions sorted out, if you will, by the first 2 levels. That means the remaining 75% roughly are going to be in that last level. And if it's something like cost, right, and it's $500 more, and now internal fixation is perceived as the winner because you put cost as the last outcome, that doesn't make sense, and you're going to get the wrong outcome, or an outcome decision that sort of doesn't jive with what's actually important and what you want to measure. So that is probably the biggest criticism of the win ratio and hierarchical composite outcomes, and you have to think about that. And so we see that as we go out and explain people this, they call us up the next day and they're like, I'm thinking of this, and this. And you're like, ooh, I think you're gonna kind of screw yourself on the last outcome, and that's probably a bad idea. So yeah, and the other common one we see is 2 continuous outcome measures. So mortality, ambulation, days alive and out of hospital, and then EQ5D or something, right? So again, you're unlikely to get to the last level if you have a continuous level above it, because almost every time there won't be a tie, and you'll have a decision there. So those are probably the 2 most common problems, if you will.
And there's one question in the chat as well, asking how do you determine the weight of each outcome? Is this in this example? You see it?
So it's a really good question, and I'm gonna defer it and answer it and defer it to the end again. So the first part is, it's not weighted. There are no weights on face value. So weighting it would make a lot of sense, but then there's of course the criticism of, well, how did you determine the weights for each outcome? So this is a non-parametric test that is unweighted. However, if you truly get into the math behind it, it is kind of weighted by the prevalence of the outcomes, right? So mortality, because it's only, let's say, 5%, doesn't contribute a lot to the outcome in the end, the overall summary of the win ratio. So it's kind of down-weighted in comparison to the outcomes that occur more often. And the reason I said I'll defer that is at the end, we're going to show you a podcast plug. And on that podcast series, the Barry podcast, they have a whole episode on the weighting and the proofs and all that kind of stuff. So more to follow on that. Great question, though. Is there another question in the chat? Let's see. I saw some. Oh, thank you. Amazing. All right, let's get caught back up. Okay, so we kind of talked about these new outcomes. I want to talk a little bit about the new design, right? So I just mentioned the win ratio. It facilitates the outcome of multiple outcomes in the order of importance. It can really decrease your sample size. I'm going to show you some examples of that, and that's the hierarchy that we've been using. Now, if you know new outcomes, new designs, sort of new game. These are my Edmonton Oilers. They're playing tonight, and there's Connor McDavid, along with Wayne Gretzky and some other stars over the years. And so Connor McDavid is the adaptive platform trial, this new wave. And really what makes adaptive platform trials different is that it's planned flexibility to test multiple interventions. I'd like to say we invented this, but clearly it comes from other fields that have been doing this for decades. Very popular in oncology, really popularized in COVID. And conceptually, it focuses on the disease, not the specific intervention. And so you can imagine multiple treatments along a continuum of care for that disease or that population, and that you could add and drop treatments or add and drop almost like research questions, and then answer them, and then drop them because you have enough answers, you have enough evidence, and bring on new ones. With the trial never really ending, which is obviously unique and really cool, but you can't just do that on the fly. It requires a lot of planning in advance, and that's the challenge with adaptive platform trials. So what is a platform? What makes it adaptive? What are the key benefits? How will it help us? So the platform trial, to kind of reiterate what I said a little bit, it allows the researchers to study multiple treatments for a disease within this overarching trial structure. And that structure tends to be a master protocol. And instead of running separate trials for each treatment with a whole new protocol, you can have one master protocol where we then add in appendices, essentially. What makes it adaptive is that idea, the idea that we can add in something after we started, as well as drop something after we started and still have the trial go on. So here's, sort of one schematic. I think there's lots of schematics that can kind of explain this. You could see that when we first start off, let's say we have 3 domains of intervention. We have some other schematics that will show this as well. But so that could be 3 different treatments, or it could be 3 different things like, should they get blood in the trauma bay? Yes, no. Should they go to angio or the operating suite for pelvic packing versus angiohemostasis? And the third one, should they have whole blood or not? Post initial resuscitation or something. You can see how there are actually different parts of your care continuum, even though they may all be happening in the same patient. But what happens is you start these domains, and after a certain period of time, you do an analysis, and we call it an interim analysis because we haven't finished the study. And every time we look at the data, it's an interim analysis. And you're probably maybe a little worried about that because in traditional sort of frequentist approaches, you're spending alpha, as they describe it, and you got to adjust your p-value for every time you look. That's not the case in the Bayesian framework. And so that makes it extremely powerful. But again, you have to do all of this a priori. You don't get to just keep looking at the data with no rules set beforehand. So I mentioned disease, not intervention. So it's sort of like, it could be as broad as oncology, critical care. COVID is perhaps a little bit better example in the sense of what the disease is. But critical care could be anybody requiring intubation, right? It doesn't have to be for this indication. You can really potentially have the disease be very, very broad. And then, of course, that plan flexibility so you can add new questions. So here's the REMAP-CAP example. Hopefully people are somewhat familiar with REMAP-CAP. And the cool thing about REMAP-CAP, which became a very popular, famous, successful COVID platform trial, was it was actually designed for community-acquired pneumonia. That's the CAP in REMAP-CAP. And when COVID came out, because the outcomes and the infrastructure were already there, they just pivoted to testing things in COVID. And they tested 50 comparisons during the COVID epidemic with multiple New England publications, right? So it shows you the power of having that infrastructure that's already set up and the rules already set up, right? And so, this was from their website a while ago, right? Just showing 26,000 patient randomizations, right? That doesn't necessarily mean how many patients they had. Actually, I think right below it shows you 15,000, right? So it tells you there was almost, double the amount of interventions. Like patients were being at least randomized more than once, which is pretty awesome. So, Sheila, do you want to talk about this? Over the years, you've kind of been working on more and more complex designs, simple design, then factorial, then master protocol. Comments about that from the logistics perspective.
Yeah, I think for me, like our group's done multiple trials in orthopedic trauma over the years. We've come close to, no, I should say close to platform trials, but we have ran the PREPIT trials under one master protocol and they functioned as sister trials. But even from that, when we finished prep it and published it and everything, we were again starting over as to what trial are we going to do next? What's the protocol going to look like? You have to start writing, you have to start applying for funding, developing your case report forms, writing your project management plans, and all your associated documents. So even though you learn from your previous trials and you as an individual and your team may become more efficient per se, you don't gain a lot of the efficiencies that are from running individual trials.
Yeah, and I think here are some of the other ones that
Mhm.
you're also alluding to. Any comments about these governance data, fiscal logistics efficiencies?
Yeah, like I think the governance with having like a single IRB or central IRB that approves the overall protocol, and then each intervention domain gets approved under the same IRB can really expedite things. Contracting and budgeting can also be made a lot faster under single agreements and that. And harmonized data collection can also be beneficial because we have a lot of the same data fields are collected across each intervention domain. So the Method Center, Data Coordinating Center team and the clinical site teams are really familiar with the data collection, both which data is being collected and the process and the procedures for entering into the database, using the database and such.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would say is a lot of us, I'm sure a lot of people on the call are um, great researchers and motivated by lots of questions. But from our perspective, one of the other things that happened was we just started to get busy, and I don't want to say overwhelmed, but we were doing a lot of things, and we start to realize that if we push at least 75% of our research questions into one framework, we may not be able to answer everything. We may have to let some really good questions go by, but at least if we can do 75%, then we're a lot more efficient. We can probably do more, um, more efficiently in that regard. So this is what we want to share with you today as essentially a case example, right? So this is MAPT, which is the musculoskeletal adaptive platform trial. So this is our answer for MSK problems. And this is our steering committee. I mentioned Nathan, who's not here today, but Nathan, myself, Sheila, Deborah Marvel, who's one of our patient partners, who's been phenomenal along this journey, Jason Connor, who's a consultant statistician, and Joe Patterson, who's running one of the first trials. And so, the six of us try and keep this heading in the right direction, as I mentioned, to answer the majority of questions, but maybe not all of the questions. So what does MAP look like? How did we set it up? Well, our population of interest is adults with a health condition affecting mobility. Very, very broad. They have to be eligible to receive either treatment in comparison. And those those intervention treatments can be anything that improves lower extremity outcomes. So for us, we're interested mainly in broken bones, but you can see how this could be done for spine, for neurologic disorders, for maybe even some brain injuries, so it's very, very, very broad. And then you see that same outcome that I showed you, that same hierarchical outcome. So we've got a very wide and entry level PICO. And when we drill in on the populations, all of these different populations could fit into that bigger mapped population: proximal femur fractures, femoral neck fractures, ankle arthritis, periprosthetic Vancouver B2 fractures. These are arthroplasty fractures. And then you can see, once you've narrowed in on that clinical problem, you can start to see the intervention domains, the comparisons that we may want to ask within that subpopulation. And all of this could actually work under one framework, all be recruiting simultaneously. And I think you'll recognize that not one patient isn't going to have all of these things, right? So now you're kind of multiple cohorts all running, but these are all essentially randomized controlled trials running within the one primary trial infrastructure. So those are the benefits. We've got this master protocol. We then just add on a comparison specific appendix. We're going to modify our sample size with our interim analyses and stopping rules. We use a Bayesian framework, which always gives you a clinical interpretation. So what that means is we speak in probabilities, not in p-values. So what is the probability that this treatment's better than that treatment? Not what is the p-value of 0.06 mean. We can add new treatments, we can drop new treatments, and we're going to share all the resources that Sheila mentioned. Here's a little schematic. Here comes that internal fixation versus arthroplasty example again. Spoiler alert, we've started running that trial. But we're hoping that we may get some anesthesia funding as well. And so you could see that maybe halfway through the arthroplasty part, there might be some funding that could answer the question about what type of anesthesia to use. And that could apply only to hip fractures. And so there would be overlap, or it could apply more broadly. And so there might be some overlap or no overlap. But once we get the answer for that first question, where the yellow is, we stop and we drop that intervention domain and we continue going on. There's also great enrollment considerations, where a single participant can be randomized multiple times along the care pathway. We tend to stay in the comparative effectiveness space, meaning these are real world comparisons. So randomizing somebody multiple times is not an ethical or a efficacy problem, because we're measuring real world effectiveness. It's a little nuanced, but happy to talk about that later. Consent forms can be streamlined because the master protocol doesn't have to be repeated. And then participants and sites can decide, what, we like this intervention, we're going to participate in this, but we're not going to participate in that. And they can still be part of the overall mapped trial infrastructure. So these are for mapped, for our platform trial, this is what we think are ideal, right? So comparative effectiveness, so the idea that treatments are being used currently and have some evidence for benefit. We always love speaking in terms of the decisional dilemma, right? Like, so when a patient like you is in front of me, should we do treatment A or should we do treatment B? And patients understand that too, and they partner with us to answer these questions, right? And then of course the study outcome is capable of measuring the treatment benefit, or vice versa. The treatment is capable of improving that study outcome that we talked about. One of the cool things about this adaptive stuff is this idea of adaptively right-sizing the trial, right? So what does that mean? Well, I think fundamentally you can understand the stuff on the left, right? Which is, we need to do the trial so that we have enough statistical certainty to change practice, right? We want to guide clinical decisions, but we should stop as soon as we have that answer, right? And so we don't want to over-recruit, but we also don't want to under-recruit, right? Like, you would hate to have that trial that recruited 400 patients and it's got a p-value of 0.055. And if they had only done 450 or 420 patients, it would have gotten the magical p-value and practice would have changed, right? So you don't want to do that either. We don't, as I mentioned, we don't use p-values. We convey results and probabilities, but we want to get it just right. And so how do we do that? So this is sort of the overall concept map of adaptive trials and interim analyses. So we start on the left, we randomize, we enroll 100 patients, let's say. We analyze those 100 patients. We look to see whether we've hit a statistical trigger. I'll talk about that shortly, which is basically, do we have enough evidence? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, we're done. The trial ends at 100 patients. If the answer is no, we consider whether we need to change the randomization properties. We continue randomizing. We do another 50 patients. We look again, trigger yes, no, and we just keep going until we have enough statistical certainty. We do build in sort of some upper limits, right? Obviously, there's not unlimited money and things like that, but we have a really good idea of what we call the operating characteristics of the trial. We know roughly what we think it'll take to reach a statistical trigger, and we know that if we hit the 600 patient maximum of our funding, we're going to have pretty good statistical certainty that there really isn't a difference either, and that's fine too. So this is what it looks like. It's a little blurry. Sorry about that. So here's our win ratio. A win ratio of 1 is the same as like a risk ratio of 1, so no difference. And you see n equals 0, and you see this line that says a prior. So this is a probability distribution, and because it's peaked at 1, we're basically telling you that we are starting at a position of believing that there's no difference, that the control and treatment are equally as likely. So that's sort of like a null hypothesis, but we're starting in probabilities. So the probability is there's no difference. And then we enroll those 100 patients that I talked about, and you see that there's a bit of a signal favoring the treatment, but there's still a lot of the bell curve, if you will, on the other side. So we don't have enough statistical certainty to say the treatment's better. In fact, we'd say the probability that it's better is 80%. That's not good enough. We had another 50 patients, another 50 patients, and we're looking each time, right? We're looking at the data, and the statistician is keeping us blinded to this and saying, no, you have not hit a statistical trigger, but they have the rules. They know, we all agreed on what a statistical trigger is. 350, and we finally hit 350 patients. We have 99% probability that that bell curve is to the right of the one. The trial stops and we drop that arm, we just stop that intervention domain. And so giving you some examples of getting it just right, as I mentioned, the lowest possible that we're going to stop at is 100. We think if there's a really large sample, really large treatment effect, that on average, or I should say 50% of the time, we'd stop at about 250 patients. And if we get to 600, we have a lot of certainty that they're pretty similar, right? So you can see the examples I was giving you earlier, that comparison for mortality would have been 1,500 patients. We're now down to a trial that's anywhere from probably 250 to 600 patients in sample size. So a huge savings. So just a couple slides left. I think in summary, platform trials are designed for that specific population, not the intervention. And you can make that population pretty broad. There's lots of partner center organizations. You can hopefully start to see what broad questions could we ask for our organization. Key thing here, of course, is that the adaptive trials are flexible and that you're testing a wide range of interventions, but using a core foundation of your infrastructure. And the other cool thing that we like about it is multiple investigators and institutions can kind of hop on and off the platform. So you can see how a center platform or a ASA platform or whatever your organization, having your own platform or two could be really beneficial. And that's what these goals are for MAP, right? We really want to become the standard for adaptive trial design in MSK. So that our funders and our regulators are familiar with that. They're like, oh, this is a trial on MAP. Yeah, we know what that is. We know that that's rigorously designed. For our clinician investigators, particularly our early stage people, to have them jump onto an already designed, vetted protocol funded by NIH, we think is really going to be helpful for them. It's plug and play. They don't have to figure out all the other logistics that most of my new mentees are like, whoa, I didn't realize Sheila has 100 pages of documents for us, and that's really important. They've never seen them before. So now this is all standardized. And we've created some flexible ways where we can run the trial for you, but we're also happy to just give you everything and let you run it at your own CTSA or method center or whatever. And center, we're looking to partner with center to try and have center help run some of this as well. We hope that increases the number of groups running trials, including nonprofits, specialty societies. We hope that it accelerates the IRB process. So I'm at University of California, Irvine. We now have a single IRB for MAPT being run by UCI. We're hoping that pushes down to contract efficiencies. We're not there yet, but we're hoping to get there. And as I mentioned, we are running this first intervention on the platform, and so that intervention is called Faster HIP. Here's an example of exactly what I was saying. So Joe Patterson at a different institution at USC is running this. It's a $14 million trial funded by PCORI. PCORI is supportive of this approach. And so we're really excited to be off and running. And so, I think to sort of summarize our progress, MAP specifically is available to any investigator. It can be run independently. We've got a bunch of other interventions under review, being proposed, et cetera. But we don't have spine, revision arthroplasty, foot and ankle, right? So you can see that there's a ton of space, even just within MAP, that we haven't even tapped yet. And these are some of the topics for further discussion. Sheila kind of jumped in at the beginning about poorly designed hierarchies, but how do you ensure that outcome is patient-centered, what other adaptive platform trials should be designed, and then how do we support new adaptive platform trials? So, I think I'll stop sharing here in a second, and these should be some of the questions we discuss. Here's the plug for the webinar, sorry, not the webinar, the podcast we were on. So Berry consultants are like the experts in this field. They spend most of their time in the FDA. And if you got lots of money, maybe you can afford to hire them. But they have a podcast called In the Interim, and it's all about Bayesian adaptive trials. It is super boring and super awesome at the same time. I love listening to it, but you might need to kind of get into it a little bit before you subscribe weekly. But it's a great podcast. So we were featured on that podcast, but there are a lot of other good episodes. We have a webinar, which is a recorded webinar, which is an expansion of the slides that we just kind of presented. And lastly, please reach out to us. We're happy to collaborate, to talk about study design, grant strategy. As I mentioned, we're trying to increase our collaborations with Center, and we're excited that this sort of methods brown bag, or whatever we want to call it, has been kicked off. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and mainly I'll ask Sheila what I forgot to say. Anything jump out to you, Sheila?
I think you covered things like very well. Does anybody have is there anything in the chat, or does anybody have any questions?
Do you folks actually help researchers design their studies, or come up with the hierarchies? Do you help them refine those for their own studies?
Yes. No. So I mean, the short answer is, I think we're all in this together, right? This is trauma research. Trauma research has traditionally been underfunded, not always rigorous. So then we don't get the funding because we're competing with cardiology that can do a double-blind trial, and they've got 1,000 investigators and big center. So like, we don't want to see research fail. So we're happy to chat with anybody and give practical tips and share what we've learned. We are at somewhat of a bandwidth issue, right? That we're not completely scalable, but these sorts of simple questions at the beginning, like how do I set up my hierarchy? How did you make it patient-centered? All that kind of stuff. We'd love to chat. We'd be happy to get on a call with anybody.
Great.
I see Jeff Wells there, so we might as well put Jeff on the spot. First of all, Jeff, should I ask where that photo is from?
It is looking at Camden Yards from a particular view at the orthopedics office. The restroom.
Very PC. That's the photo from the bathroom at my own clinic. So Jeff, I was going to put you on the spot because we did talk a little bit about like how do you ensure the hierarchy is patient-centered, right? So one of the ways that we do is through something called discrete choice experiments, which are a set of surveys that I'll elaborate on. But Jeff, when we come to you and say, hey, these are some of the things that we're thinking about, how do you help us make sure that it's patient-centered?
One of the first times I really thought about this was there's a kind of a standardized evaluation on mobility, the 10 steps, can you walk? And that's good, and that gives you a piece of data. But as a patient, if the bathroom's 12 steps away, that's not really important to me. So asking the questions, what is important? Kind of like staying alive. So we'll stick with that as probably the primary. Apparently my camera does not want to stay alive.
Yeah, so that's a great example, Jeff. And I don't want to put Deborah on the spot per se, but I will share that she was also very helpful. So we had our hierarchy sorted out, but there was still some tweaking in terms of ambulation as to how we described ambulation, right? So you say something like, "Can you walk across the room, like you were saying, Jeff, with or without a walking aid. And Deb was very good at saying, yes, but I wouldn't normally, or yes, normally I can, but sometimes I can't, right? And so how do we nuance that and continue to iterate the outcome to make sure we've got it right before we move to the trial? So we try and spend a lot of time in that space to get it right. And I saw there was a question in the chat from Lori about variables being added as new treatment outcomes are added to the platform. So, and then how do you implement the consistency? So the answer is some variables may be added, but the core set, it isn't, right? So, Arissa Tori's an anesthesiologist who's going to be looking at some regional anesthesia stuff. The primary outcome for MAPT is the primary outcome for MAPT, which is that hierarchy of mortality, ambulation, days alive at home. But you can imagine that if you're doing an anesthesia trial instead of an orthopedic surgery trial, you may want to add pain, or you may want to add some certain anesthesia complications, nausea, whatever it may be. So those secondary outcomes can be added no problem, and they go in the intervention appendix. So Lori, when we go to then train a site or the research staff on a new intervention domain that's being added, then naturally we have to train them on those components of that intervention domain. So we do have to make sure that new data is collected and trained.
But there's a lot of efficiencies because they're already familiar. Like we use the same electronic data capture system or EDC system. So the sites are really familiar with the overall structure of how the system works and how our data collection flows. And with it being like right now, it's at one data coordinating center. So the clinical sites get really used to the research team at the data coordinating center and the processes and that. So the training is like, it's a lot simpler because you're training on a handful of case report forms and a handful of procedural changes versus starting over each time with an entire new trial, new team, new processes, etc.
Yeah, and there's efficiencies obviously in terms of like the baseline data collection. You don't have to, if you have them into two separate intervention domains, you wouldn't necessarily have to repeat that. I think in our field at center, like the center organizations, for the most part, it's unlikely that you're going to get a lot of dual enrollment at different times. But when you talk to some of these bigger COVID and bigger adaptive platform trials that have been out there outside of our field, it is actually a concern that, somebody comes in, they have their injury, their intervention, whatever, and then 4 months later, they show up at another hospital that's also recruiting, or they even show up at the same hospital and you didn't realize it's the same person. And how do you not enter them as a duplicate person and stuff like that? So all these things have been identified, addressed, et cetera. We're not quite there at MAPT. We don't think it's going to be a huge problem, but eventually you could get into those problems. Other questions? Michelle, do you have? Yeah, there you go.
Yes, I do. So I was actually just thinking about that and the opportunity for patients to potentially be enrolled in different interventions within the same hospital stay, or at a subsequent hospital visit, or at a different hospital, depending on where they ended up being taken in the terms of, if it's a trauma, as opposed to, elective. And I was wondering if you use something like a global unique identifier to try to identify when patients turn up again in in a different location or.
Yeah, so again, we haven't really solved this because we don't really think it's gonna be a problem, but other people have solved it, right? And I'll touch on the nuances, right? So, we can't necessarily use MRNs and then send MRNs from your hospital to the center, right? So you're already into some unique identifier, right? So then it's hard for the method center to know that this is a different person because you're generating a different, or the same person because you're generating a different identifier. So there are actually probabilistic, like, AI, machine learning, Bayesian analyses that you can run at a big data center, which would say, okay, this person's the same age, with these same comorbidities, et cetera, what is the probability that this is actually somebody we already have in the database? And so you can flag it and you can actually run queries in that regard. But we're not there yet. So there's that part. And then the other part is just about, could they have the same, like, could they be enrolled in multiple things at the same hospitalization? And the answer in our framework for MAPT is yes. And that's totally okay, because we only have comparative effectiveness stuff, which means they're sort of already at whatever probability of receiving either one of the treatments, depending on the practitioners and stuff that they encounter.
Right.
Sheila, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's less of an issue too, because we're not sharing controls.
That's exactly, I was going to bring that up. Yeah.
Yeah, it's less of an issue for MAP because the control, like each intervention domain has its own control. So in the faster hip trial, we have arthroplasty versus internal fixation, but those patients aren't going to be, as we've designed it presently, they're not going to be a control group. So any new patient will still be an independent, like, observation from a statistical analysis perspective. So that's less of an issue in the way that we've set up MAP, but it's definitely an issue for like Remap Cap, where I believe they do have a shared control arm. So patients shouldn't be enrolled at multiple time points, but they can be enrolled at the beginning initially.
Yeah. The shared controls is a big area of controversy. And really the short summary on that is, at some point down the line, how long, like the historical control that was enrolled in the trial 5 years ago, what else has changed in the last 5 years? Is that an appropriate control? And so that's where a lot of the controversy comes from. And as Sheila said, we're not using historic controls in our analyses.
Yeah. We're going on to 5 o'clock.
Right.
Where I am. Are there any, should we preparation for dinner time and such? Is there
For sure.
Is there anything else? Any other questions? I know Jordan and I can chat about this and debate this all afternoon, but just if anyone has
We
any
definitely
questions.
could.
Yeah.
I do see Deb's hat though. That's quite nice. We were talking about you earlier, Deb, and now Jeff usually has some fancy McMaster hat or whatever, but Deb's got a beautiful pink hat for the Anteaters, UC Irvine, my new institution. So thank you for the tip of the hat there, Deb. Awesome. Pam, Michelle, thank you so much for having us. To everybody else that signed on, thanks for joining. We really want to see what other people are doing. As I mentioned, I sort of opened by saying I know there are other common problems, like how do you consent patients when they're unconsentable, and some of these things we've solved really well in trauma, and other things we haven't solved well. Randomization is a big problem for trauma trials, and so let's keep these discussions going.
Great. Thank you so much for being our first presenter. And I will send out a recording, and I'll also send out a link to the website where people can ask questions, present problems that they'd like to see in another webinar. And we will pair you with someone from the center community to answer that question in the future. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.